Probably the people who make their living off of writing books and being in the metaphysical world really focus on doing a lot of spell books. And a lot of us who are serious about magic really don't tend to get the spell books because we want the theory books and want to know how to do things. And I really wanted to kind of have a compromise because quite a few people who were interested in my work and have come to see me speak and take my classes really found the witchcraft books a little too thick, a little too serious, a little too kind of dark and scary for them, even though they're really not. But just really judging a book by the cover and how it looked. And a lot of them were kind of looking for and went for the traditional spell book. So I wanted to write a spell book that could serve the needs of people who were just starting and were interested, yet at the same time got a little bit deeper into spirituality and got a little deeper into theology. And it really was based on my first experience with spellcraft. The real first time I learned how to cast spells in witchcraft classes was about really instant magic. It was really about this, how to change your immediate reality, how to get into a quick, easy meditative state, how to do basic physical healing through breath work and through energy work, and how to really, change your environment in very simple and very easy ways that don't seem all that spiritual, like getting a parking space when you're at the mall, or, guessing who it is when the phone is ringing, kind of sharpening your intuition in that way. But all those little experiences start to get you to a place of realizing how everything is connected and how you're connected to a greater pattern in the universe, and everything that you do can affect that universe, and everything the universe does around you and everybody does around you can affect you. So rather than kind of give a recipe and spell book, it's really a book that teaches the technique of how to figure out what do you want to accomplish, what are the various ways of doing it, how can you tune into the forces of the universe. It might be visualization for some people, it might be affirmations and kind of magical words and chants for another. Others might petition a deity or a saint or an angel or a fairy being or something like that. And there's just a lot of different methods of tuning into magic in the moment and trying to bring a magical spirituality into every moment that you have. So I wanted to kind of do what seemingly looks like a very light book and very easy book, but at the same time, really have a deeper spirituality to it. So people, once they start reading it and think, oh, this is a book that will solve my problems, they can, get some lifelong skills that will change their life and really help them out in the future.
Well, one of the things I noticed in what you're saying is you kind of use magic and witchcraft interchangeably.
For my practice, my magic is based in witchcraft, and I identify as a witch. But, I really see witchcraft as kind of a much larger calling to the priestess and priesthood. I think you can perform magic and not be a witch. But I think most witches that I know and I train are involved in magic as a part of their spirituality. I think when I'm not speaking to a group of witches, I tend to use the term magical spirituality.
Okay.
Well, I don't necessarily see them synonymous, and I know there's some witches out there, and Wiccans will say, you don't have to do magic to be a witch, but for the way that I've experienced it and the way that I teach it, I think it's a pretty integral part of it.
Well, how did you get into witchcraft? When did you start with your magical practices?
I actually, right after high school, I actually ended up going to a Catholic school all my life, and really went into it as a skeptic. I had a friend of mine who was really an older mentor and first boss, and was really just a great person in my life and really attached to my family. And she slowly came out of the broom closet to me about being involved in witchcraft, and little by little, and then finally she kind of just came out and told me. And I thought at first she was joking, and then once I realized she was serious, I thought she was a little crazy. And the more we discussed it, the more I realized that maybe there was something there that I wanted to know more about, but I still thought she was a little nuts, because I was really coming from an academic, scientific background, and if you couldn't see it and prove it and bring it to a lab, then it couldn't quite be real. And luckily, she was very much involved in maybe what we consider to be fringe science and quantum physics and holographic universe theory and things like that. So she was able to present things to me in a way that, really made sense to the scientist aspect of it. And then she invited me to a ritual, and I had a very, very powerful experience with that, and that was very amazing. And I started to study the tarot with her. I started to study basics of meditation and basics of ritual, and just kind of got to a point where she felt that she taught me all that she could, because she wasn't that far along, and sent me down to her teacher, who was a woman named Lori Cabot down in Salem, Massachusetts, pretty well known for her books and some of her political action. And that's really how I got my foundational training. And then from there, really got involved in healing and the healing arts, and kind of branched out from witchcraft to try to understand broader metaphysics. And, really, to me, I have a very wide definition of witchcraft, and I really see when you're working with the earth and the sky, and you see divinity as mother and father and god and goddess, and you're working magic, and you honor the ancestors, and you honor the elements in nature, and work with the three realms of the heavens, the earth, and the underworld. I think that's some form of witchcraft, even though most people wouldn't call it that. You can be a Native American shaman, and you wouldn't consider yourself a witch, but I think there's a lot in common with that. And that's where I see my spiritual kinship. I really tend to look at things from a broad world perspective, and what are the similar truths that many magical spiritual traditions hold, and that's the strands I try to kind of weave my own tradition from in my own personal practice.
Well, you've got a number of books that kind of approach these subjects in a different way, and I guess you map them to the elements, your various temple series. Mm-hmm. And so I guess it's a series of 5 books?
Right. It's actually 3 are in print right now, and the 4th is going to be in production soon. I'm in the midst of writing the 5th.
Okay. And which ones are out, and which elements do they map to?
The first one is called the Inner Temple of Witchcraft, and that's for fire. The second is called the Outer Temple of Witchcraft, and that's for earth. And the third that's out is called the Temple of Shamanic Witchcraft, and it's for water. And the other 2 that will be forthcoming next fall, in fall of 2007, will be the Temple of High Witchcraft, which is for air, and then the Living Temple of Witchcraft, which will be for spirit.
Okay.
And if all goes well and I don't go mad before then, I'll be doing a tarot deck, too.
Oh, excellent.
Try to kind of bring together the teachings of the 5 books in a pictorial form.
Why did you start with fire?
You know, well, I really kind of based it, the way I learned witchcraft wasn't the traditional kind of Gardnerian, Alexandrian, you know, here are the tools, here's the ceremony, here's how you cast spells, that a lot of my peers have gone through. Going into it as a skeptic, the kind of training and teaching that I had was, you know, here's the magical theories, and here's lighting the inner spark within you, and here's to see vision. And a lot of the things I learned as witchcraft, I think a lot of people learn in basic metaphysics and learning how to visualize, learning how to open the third eye and do psychic work, learning how to astral travel, learning how to speak with spirit guides. To me, that was all very witchy, and it lit an inner flame, and it really got me in touch with my will. They were all very psychic initiatory experiences. Like, once I had them, I realized that I was different and that I could connect to things, and everybody was connected to these things, but if you really focused on them, you could really change and transform yourself. So for me, I think if I started with the traditional earth, here's the wheel of the year, and here's how to do ritual, I know my very, very first rituals in witchcraft, even though they were profound for me, they were profound because they had results, but the actual experience of it was really kind of mundane for me. Coming from a Catholic background, it seemed a lot more like that kind of ritual and structure. I'd go from that ritual and say, you know, people would say, can you feel the energy? Could you hear the voice of the gods? Could you do this? Could you do that? And I'd be like, oh no, we're just standing around in robes. You know, I didn't feel anything profound. When people say, can you feel the energy of the rock, or can you feel the energy of whatever ritual tool, it took me a long time to feel energy. And a lot of the exercises for fire and a lot of the things that I really first learned as a foundation from my teachers was about how to sense energy and how to feel energy and how to open that inner light. And I think that was really important, because then once I had that, I could go into ritual and be like, oh, I really can feel this, and I can really see it. And when we call the elements, I feel a presence, and when we call the deities, I feel a presence. But up until that training, I always just felt it was kind of ritual and felt a little silly in my robes and felt a little silly calling down to the moon because I didn't feel anything. And once I had that training, I could feel things. So I have a lot of students that kind of mirror what my experience has been. And, you know, I have a lot of students that are skeptics, and I have a lot of students that have difficulty with psychic ability, or if they have a really great psychic ability but don't really know how to control it. So I think the first level is really kind of getting those energies under control and opening to people who need to be opened up and calming down the people who need to be calmed down before you start doing spellcraft and ritual.
Okay. Now, the one that's coming out now is Temple of High Witchcraft, and that's associated with air?
That's associated with air. That'll be coming out next year, fall of 2007.
Fall of 2007.
Yep.
And that one is probably your most ceremonial magic-based?
Definitely. Almost all the lessons are based on one of the spheres in the Tree of Life. It really goes through each of the spiritual experiences, and it's a very deconstructionist point of view on magic. I think a lot of witches are highly influenced by ceremonial magic, but a lot of them don't want to admit it, or a lot of them are ignorant of it and don't really know a lot of the ties between early Wicca and ceremonial magic. So what I really wanted to do was talk a little bit about the history of that and kind of show some of the practices. You know, a lot of people think if they call out to the four quarters and, you know, yell out to the guardians of the watchtowers of the east, that, you know, that was an ancient witchcraft tradition, but that has such a tie into ceremonial magic, and a lot of witches don't realize that. So I wanted to get a little bit more educated about that and to be able to educate my students. Pretty much all these five books are based on 5 classes that I teach. So I'm just really trying to put the classes into book form. And then what we do through the different lessons is that we look at the different rituals that are available through ceremonial magic, the things that have kind of become standards, and we try to, you know, really analyze what are they doing here, how are they doing it. Now, learn how to do it, but if the symbolism doesn't necessarily work for you, what's the symbolism theologically that works for you? Like a lot of witches have a hard time with ceremonial magic because of the Hebrew. Although the Hebrew is very powerful, if you shudder every time you hear the Hebrew, then you might want to do it in Greek. You might want to have a translation or a different version of it in Gaelic, if you're coming from a Celtic tradition. But the idea of the banishing rituals, the idea of the invoking rituals, they all have a certain power to them. And even if you choose never to use them, I think it's a really good part of the witch's training to understand how these rituals work, because so many witches are really intimidated. They pick up a ceremonial magic book and they think, oh, this is high magic, this has nothing to do with me. But I think when we really start to think about theurgy, I think witchcraft has a lot to do with theurgy, the idea of really communing with the divine and communing with the higher self, the higher soul, the holy guardian angel, whatever you'd like to call it. And I think a lot of witches miss out on that aspect of the spirituality because they're intimidated by the text.
Well,
so they just want to give them a primer so they can look at these different texts and not be intimidated.
Okay. Now, you mentioned the Tree of Life. How do you approach elemental magic within this book?
Within the Temple of High Witchcraft?
Yes.
Well, I have to say I take a page from Jason Augustus Newcomb, who's a great guy, and we've developed a bit of a friendship. And I don't follow always the standard Golden Dawn elemental association. I do put earth to Malkuth, but I put water to Yesod and air to Hod and fire to Netzach. And then we kind of go through and climb the tree, and each of the spheres is a lesson, and we talk about I talk a lot about the visions and the virtues and the vices, and really trying to get into the idea of the spiritual experience of it. But we also get into the correspondences and the tools of each, and there's a meditation and path working based on each of the lessons.
Now, I can understand that particular arrangement on the lower part of the tree, but can you explain why you're doing that and why you're deviating from the particular Golden Dawn?
Well, for me, it seems like the strongest symbolism coming from the Golden Dawn was to match the Yod-Heh, Vav-Heh elemental correspondences. But before I really got into ceremonial magic, a lot of my witchcraft training had a deep planetary influence. And to me, the planets, when you look at the moon, that just really screams much more water to me. And even when we look at the way that I path work to Yesod, that's just much more watery to me, and the astral foundation. And when I think of the language aspect of Hod, that's just much more air to me. So, I have all these prefaces and warnings for a lot of the traditionalists in the book, saying if you're looking for a traditional book in Kabbalah, you've picked up the wrong book, and here's the ones I recommend. But this is really what seems to make the most sense to me, and when I teach other witches in the Tree of Life, that tends to work the best for them. So I think a lot of it's been trial and error, and I'd say out of all the classes I've taught and out of all the temple books that I've written for these 5 books, this was probably the hardest one, because it was really trying to reconcile, a tradition that's not necessarily mine, even though I've studied it, and I really admire its influence upon my craft and upon my magic, and wanting to honor that, and wanting to use the ways that I've applied it to my life, but also kind of keeping in mind that the ways I've applied it might not necessarily be the ways that traditionalists in the book or even other people have applied it. Now,
when you said that you have moved the various elements to those spheres, what directions do you put them in?
Well, that's interesting. When I teach circle casting in a traditional witchcraft context, it was interesting as I got kind of out into the world and got better educated reading more books, because the way that I was originally taught wasn't the way that's standard. And even today, like if I'm at a festival and I'm asked to take part in a larger public ritual, I almost have to kind of flip a switch and rewire myself to the more traditional associations, because most places that I've come across, particularly the more festivals and public venues I've been doing, start in the east, and they traditionally put air in the east, fire in the south, water in the west, and earth in the north. And the way I had learned it was actually starting in the north and really having this strong point of aligning yourself with the magnetism of the earth and really finding that magnetic north and tuning into it as a part of your rituals. And we actually put the opposites to the opposite elemental correspondences. We'd have earth in the north and air in the south to have an earth-air opposition. And we put fire in the east and water in the west to have that fire-water opposition. And it wasn't until a little bit later, and I really never thought to question my teachers, like, well, why do we do this? And, why is this different from other places? It was just kind of, that was what was done. You go along with, the group as you're experiencing it. But the more I kind of studied and the more I researched, and particularly some of the healing and herbal work that, looked onto the old Greek healing, would talk about the alchemical maps and kind of looking at the oppositions of fire and water and earth and air and looking at the qualities of earth and, fire being warm and dry and air being warm and moist, and kind of plotting that around the wheel and realizing that was also the cycle of transformation. So when I teach circle casting and when I teach elemental correspondences, I actually believe there's a fluidity to it. I believe as long as you have all four elements and you put them in a direction and call them from someplace, I think the circle can work. I really think the elemental realms aren't literally in directions. They're in a direction they can't be pointed to. I think we put them on that symbolic compass because that's the easiest way for us to comprehend it.